here. I always have to get that, Brian Flynn, okay, here today to speak to us, and we appreciate you being here, and we're certainly welcome your important comments.
Thank you, members of the advisory board, for having me here today, and for holding a special meeting so that we could come and update you on the consent order. It's been a topic that we've heard individually from a number of you, as well as a number of people in the audience. It's something that's critical to the state of New Mexico. Certainly from the Environment Department's perspective, it's critical in that it allows us to move forward with cleanup at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and that's our top priority. It's also critical for others in the room because it allows us to go to Congress on an annual basis in order to advocate for budget for cleanup work that needs to be done at the lab. So I'm going to begin by providing just an overview of where we are today with respect to the consent order, and then Katie Roberts, our division director for the Resource Protection Division, will come up and talk to you a little more specifically about the consent order itself and some of the process going forward, and then Katie will hand it back to me to kind of talk about at the end where we are in terms of next steps. And I think the main point, besides giving you a briefing on where we are today, is also to give you a chance to think about what information you need from us in order to help allow you to participate meaningfully in the process of determining the remaining schedule of work up at Los Alamos National Laboratory. So I think as the leader of the Environment Department, we certainly want to make sure that we're giving you enough information so that you can truly participate in this process and identify priorities in terms of the cleanup work that will be done going forward. And so that's one of the main things that, besides just briefing you on where we are today, that we would really like to hear from you as well, in addition to any other comments that you may have. But specifically, I think we're looking for direction from you as to what additional information you need in order to help you provide meaningful feedback once we begin soliciting public comment moving forward on this. Just as an overview of a reminder, if you will, of what the consent order is. It was executed in 2005, and essentially the consent order is a settlement agreement. It resolved claims between the state of New Mexico and Los Alamos National Laboratory, and I'm using Los Alamos National Laboratory broadly to include the other signatories to the agreement, which at the time was the University of California system, who was managing the laboratory. And since then, Los Alamos National Security has now taken over that work. But it's an agreement essentially between the state and the laboratory regarding the investigation and remediation of contamination from legacy waste management activities up at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And so this document itself resolved claims that the state had against the laboratory for contamination that had occurred. Now, at the time that this agreement was signed in 2005, we had a very strong sense of certain contamination at the laboratory, but we also had a very clear understanding that a lot of additional investigation was warranted because there was, quite frankly, a lot of additional contamination that we did not know about. And the most prominent example of contamination that was unknown in 2005 would be the chromium contamination in the groundwater up around Los Alamos National Laboratory. At the time that the agreement was signed in 2005, that chromium contamination had not yet been discovered. And so the goal of the consent order is to investigate, characterize the nature and the extent of the legacy waste contamination, and then put in place a process for remediating all of that contamination. And that's essentially what this document does. The cost of the remaining work that is required under the consent order, currently the Department of Energy estimates to be $1.2 billion. And that figure was not developed by my agency. That was developed by the Department of Energy during a life cycle baseline analysis. And I put in my presentation that I believe that that's far too low. And the reason why I believe that that's far too low is because we haven't gone through the process of selecting what remedies will be necessary to clean up all of the contamination sites around Los Alamos National Laboratory. So in order to build that cost estimate, which was recently estimated to be $1.2 billion to complete the remaining work under the consent order, the Department of Energy would need to make a number of assumptions regarding what the remedies, which are what they sound like, they're the approaches we're going to utilize for actually cleaning up the area, what those would be. Now that process of selecting remedies is something that requires participation not only from the public, but active participation from the Department of Energy. And then finally, my agency. The Department of Energy evaluates all the different potential cleanup options. They then determine what they believe is the most appropriate. However, we are not bound by their determination. My agency actually determines what the most appropriate remedy will be for each contamination site at the lab. And so, for example, the Department of Energy has submitted 4 corrective measures evaluations to my agency under the old consent order. And the Department of Energy typically uses cap and cover as their preferred remediation alternative. And so building a budget for the Department of Energy, they would assume that their preferred remedy is the final remedy. And I would suggest that their presumption that cap and cover is the ultimate final remedy for each of these sites is misplaced. But we have to go through that process and actually determine what will be the appropriate remedy for each particular site after we've gathered information and arrived at all those facts. So because I think there's a lot of assumptions built into their baseline analysis of what the cost would be, I believe that $1.2 billion is far too low, that the cost of cleanup is going to far exceed $1.2 billion at the site. Now, why is this cost important? Well, number one, that governs the time for how much work we can do each and every year. And I've asked the Department of Energy during their presentation to talk to you all a little bit, based on some of the feedback I've heard from you all previously, about how they use money each year. And so, for example, they have $189 million right now for remediation cleanup work at the lab site. How much of that 189 is actually spent on discretionary cleanup activities, and how much is related to fixed costs and overhead? And so really, in order to understand a schedule and start planning time for how long it will take to complete the work, we need to understand what it's going to cost for each and every aspect of this. And so cost is critical, since that's what will govern the amount of time it takes to actually complete this project. Cost is also critical, and having a schedule is also critical, because the people who have the greatest influence of our budget, our congressional delegation, other members of Congress, and the President need to know what the plan is before they'll be willing to budget money. And that's a message I've heard repeatedly. And the next slide that I'll show you will really, I think, put some clarity onto that issue of planning in order to help get the budget developed that we need. And the last bullet I make, just kind of providing an overview. We recognize and agree that there needs to be a new schedule to secure increased funding that will be necessary for remediation. In 2012, I believe, but a couple of years ago, the Department of Energy publicly acknowledged that the current schedule that was in place for finishing the remediation work up at Los Alamos was not realistic, and that would not be met. And that was not a surprise to us, nor I think anyone in the public who've been following this. They simply had not even begun to tackle some of the most difficult and pressing cleanup tasks at the lab. So I don't think that came as a surprise to anyone. However, the fact that we don't have a schedule and a viable plan in place is something that I think puts us at a disadvantage as a state when it comes to securing the funding that we need in order to do the work moving forward. So we absolutely agree that we need a new schedule in order to drive this process going forward. We also agree with the Department of Energy that there are ways to improve this process. in terms of how we actually plan work and organize work moving forward. So the schedule, according to my staff and I, needs to drive work, and Katie Roberts will talk more about this, as opposed to driving deliverables. And Katie will explain this in more detail, the difference between a deliverable, which is essentially a piece of paper saying, here's a plan, and then, which is a critical first step, but doesn't actually get any work completed or cleaned up, and then doing the work that's called out under that plan. And this is the slide I mentioned before, and I thought this chart, which I got from, actually from Congress, was really critical to this point about where we are today with our schedule. And the biggest point on the chart here is that every single site has a date here, all the cleanup sites. And this title was from the congressional report that I pulled this from. Every single site where there's ongoing remediation work has a date for when the cleanup work will be completed, except Los Alamos National Laboratory, which has a TBD. And this was something that was pointed out to me by staff at the Office of Management and Budget, as well as a number of committee staffers when I was in Washington, D.C. last week, meeting with members of both the Senate and House subcommittees that determine the budget for cleanup work at Los Alamos National Laboratory. The fact that we don't currently have a date, we don't have a viable plan in place. So it is critical that we develop a plan. Now, we've specifically been waiting to move forward with developing a plan until settlement agreements for outstanding compliance issues with the Department of Energy are resolved. And I've heard some comments about we've waited too long, and I think those comments have a really loose affiliation with reality, or really don't understand how you actually deal with disputes on a high level, because, quite frankly, this document and this schedule is our leverage to ensure that work will be done and that settlement agreements will be favorably resolved. And so why on earth would I agree to renegotiate a document that contains a lot of pressure points on the Department of Energy when I haven't resolved other critical issues at the lab site? And so, certainly, I think it's a sound strategy, and there's certainly a time and a place for having this discussion. We agree it's a discussion that needs to occur, and Katie will talk to you a little bit more detail about some of the issues in the current consent order that we think can be improved in a new version of this document. At this point, the state has not begun having negotiations regarding exactly what changes will be made to this document. We've internally been reviewing the document for the past couple of months and looking at ways that it could be improved. But again, we're going to wait until a settlement agreement for the compliance issues that were identified at the Los Alamos after the radiation release at the WIP facility are resolved before we sit down and engage in substantive negotiations regarding the consent order itself. But we certainly have had quite a few discussions internally about the document and how we could make it work better. And with that, I'll turn it over to Katie Roberts to kind of talk in a little bit more detail about these issues, and then I'll see you at the end. Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. And thank you to the board again. So we do understand that this is a special meeting that you organized for us, and we truly appreciate that. This is a very important topic to quite a few people, clearly. So to really expand on what Ryan really just laid out for you, there were 4 main areas that the department felt were necessary improvements for the revised document. So I'm going to walk through them in probably not as much detail as some might be expecting, but here's where we are at this point. So, let's see. Okay, so the 2005 consent order was milestone or deliverable driven. So, meaning that the due dates for documents are what actually drove the work scope, rather than factors like risk to human health. So a good example of that was when the due date for the investigation remediation report for MDA-B, or Material Disposal Area B, was established. At the time, I think the lab had very good estimates about what the total volume of waste would be that was excavated, but it ended up being double that. And the current 05 consent order doesn't really allow for a whole lot of flexibility in that process. Secondly, the consent order, the 05 consent order, was very focused on investigation and characterization. Now, that was necessary for the approximately 2,000 sites that they have up at the laboratory, but now we're kind of beyond that at this point. There's been 10 years of investigation and characterization activities at the laboratory, and now we need to change that focus. Thirdly, the 2005 consent order included very prescriptive, detailed deadlines for several types of documents. So work plans, investigation reports, and also corrective measures evaluation reports. But it didn't really allow for flexibility or adjustments in work scope based on a change in priorities. And as the Secretary just mentioned, the best example we have of that is actually the discovery of the chromium plume into the 2004-2005 timeframe. You'll notice that even the revised consent order online that was revised in October, I believe, of 12, has nothing in the schedule tables about the chromium plume. The fourth and final point here are the prescriptive sampling and analytical methods. Now, most of the methods that are included in the consent order have a basis in EPA guidance, but they're also, as I said, overly prescriptive at this point. And those things are necessary, but the field methods need to allow for flexibility if there are new advancements or in analytical methods or even field sampling procedures. So how does the department determine how we're going to implement those new improvements to a revised consent order? Now, keep in mind these are still at a very high level in terms of description, but in order to change the focus of the consent order from milestone-driven or deliverable-driven, we would like to change what's being referred to, change it to you'll hear more actually about this in DOE's presentation, but related to what they call the campaign approach. That approach is designed to group work into discrete projects based on priorities and other criteria, for example, risk to human health or geographic areas. And the campaigns are designed to be conducted from start to finish. So meaning from the submittal of an initial work plan all the way to the final execution and submittal of final documents. And the campaigns would contain multiple milestones, which could be anything from an activity, like a well installation, to document submittals or other activities that would be identified in the future. And the campaigns would be designed to span multiple years. As many of you know, this work can take an awful long time. And so those campaigns will likely span large periods of time. So secondly, now that all of this investigation and characterization has been conducted, the focus of the consent order really needs to shift and be focused on cleanup. I don't think we're going to have any arguments about that. And if the consent order is focused on cleanup activities, we can more effectively plan resources within the Environment Department, as well as DOE can request appropriate funding levels necessary to complete that work. It's a planning tool. Third, so I think we've learned a lot of lessons over the last 10 years with the 2005 consent order. And one of those lessons is that the deadlines established in those fabulous Section 12 tables of the 2005 consent order are fairly unrealistic at this point. I think everyone was well-intentioned in 2005, but every time something new is discovered, it changes that time frame. So that's why we would like to focus more on what we're referring to as the annual work planning process. So this is actually a concept that was contemplated in the 2012 Framework Agreement after the Las Conchas fire, and it has been implemented over the last several years. The theory is that the parties, so the Environment Department and the laboratory, would meet once a year to establish the work scope and the priorities for the upcoming fiscal year. And that's also going to allow for reevaluation of priorities, newly identified work scope, and also funding considerations. So finally on this, our final improvement that we see from at least a general level is in order to change a focus from the use of prescriptive field and analytical methods, we would very much like to draw from existing EPA guidance and use what are referred to as data quality objectives. Now, data quality objectives are recurrent through all of EPA guidance when it comes to record corrective action. This is not a new theme. Lots of the DOE complex actually focus on data quality objectives. So the idea is that Los Alamos would establish the objective of the work scope, and that's typically going to be in a work plan or other document, and NMED would approve those objectives. So, for example, if you have an objective to define the nature and extent of contamination at a particular site, that would be an objective of that particular work scope. Then, LANL's going to go out, they're going to execute that work, and describe how they achieved the established and approved objectives in the follow-on document. And that's typically in the form of an investigation report or other similar document. And much of that will actually include a description of the analytical or sampling methods that were used while they were out in the field executing that work. So that kind of gives you a very general, high-level overview of what we see as, the four major categories of improvement for the revised document. But I think the logical next question is, okay, well, what's not going to change? What do we think is actually good and executable in the current document as it stands today? So I just wanted to cover these. There are basically four concepts here. So any work that was covered under the 2005 consent order will be covered by the revised consent order, including any newly identified work. It's a really important point. Secondly, the public participation process for remedy selections. This process is not going to change, my apologies. And I think it's really important as a reminder for people how the CME, or the Corrective Measures Evaluation process, works. So, and I'm going to use the acronym CME, so if anyone doesn't remember, please just say, can you repeat that? So Corrective Measures Evaluation reports, they're designed to evaluate all the potential alternatives for remediation at a particular site. So you're going to look at everything from do absolutely nothing to the most conservative, which in most cases is complete excavation. So the report will also propose, so the laboratory will propose a recommended alternative. And that alternative is typically going to include multiple technologies. So for example, groundwater monitoring, soil vapor extraction, and a cap. Those are examples of multiple technologies that would be included in one alternative. NMED will then review that document and will eventually issue what's called a statement of basis for the proposed chosen remedy. NMED's remedy, this is also a very important point that the Secretary touched on, that remedy may be different than what LANL has proposed in their CME report. So the statement of basis is also part of a notification for a public comment period, which is a minimum of 60 days under the current rules. The notification is sent to the facility mailing list, which is maintained by NMED, and it's published in a local newspaper. The public, during that time frame, has the opportunity to provide written comments, but also to request a public hearing during that comment period. If a hearing is requested and granted, the public comment period will actually be extended through the end of that hearing. Now, if in the case that the hearing is held, most of you actually probably know this by now, but it's a very formal process. A hearing officer is assigned to the case, and all those wishing to be a party at the hearing, anyone who wants to participate, provide testimony, must file the appropriate paperwork. The hearing itself can last anywhere from a few days to many weeks. The hearing officer will hear testimony from all of the participants, as well as all of the parties to the hearing are permitted to cross-examine the witnesses that are party to that hearing. So in a lot of ways, it sounds very similar to almost like a trial proceeding in court. So following the hearing officer will prepare and issue a hearing officer's report, which will recommend a decision for the NMED secretary. And it may take anywhere from 3 to 6 months, sometimes even longer, for the hearing officer to issue his or her report. Now, either following the hearing, if there is one, or simply following the end of the public comment period, the Environment Department Secretary will review the hearing officer report and issue a decision on a final remedy, as well as issue a response to all of the written comments received within 90 days of the end of the public comment period. Then, at the very end of this process, on that decision, unless it's appealed, of course, the laboratory would then begin preparing what's called a corrective measures implementation plan for the selected remedy that will then be submitted to the Environment Department for review and approval. That's kind of a lengthy description, but I think it's really important for all of you to understand the stringency of that process. Actually, let me go back to this. So, talked about public participation. That third point, stipulated penalties. NMED still intends for stipulated penalties to be part of the revised document. Now, for those of you who don't know what stipulated penalties are, these are effectively fines applied to activities or deliverables that are not subject to what's called dispute resolution or judicial actions. Finally, cleanup levels. The cleanup levels that are currently established in the 2005 consent order will remain the same. We have no intention of changing those. So with that really covers our high-level concepts of how we want to improve this document, and I'm going to turn it back over to Secretary Flynn to talk you through our next steps.
Thanks, Katie. Okay, so thank you, Katie. I wanted to just kind of go back to this last slide because this is really important too. Just based on some of the feedback I've heard, which regarding the settlement agreements that we're currently finalizing with the Department of Energy for violations at Los Alamos and at WIP, and that is this concept of stipulated penalties. I've heard people suggest that we're waiving our authority to enforce and impose any penalties going forward against the laboratory, and that could not be farther from the truth. So I just want to make it very clear that that has never been considered, nor has it ever been agreed to. We did, however, as part of our settlement agreement, which hopefully will be finalized, request at the behest, actually the suggestion of the community down in Carlsbad, which we thought was a great idea, and that was to have every 3 years to have an independent audit of the entire facility, both for Los Alamos and for WIP. Not only focused on regulatory issues, but also looking at operational issues and the physical structure, infrastructure issues at the facilities themselves as well. And as part of that comprehensive audit, we did agree that the results of that audit would not be used to impose an enforcement action against DOE so long as they agreed to voluntarily fix all the issues that are identified in the audit process. And this is something we do in a variety of our other programs where if people invite us, and the best example is our OSHA program, where we want employers to invite our inspectors onto their property in order to do an inspection. We have a legal right to do inspections, and we do that all the time, but we feel like compliance is the ultimate outcome that we want, both from the environment or, in OSHA's case, for worker safety. So people can participate in voluntary programs with us at any point in time in the year that are separate from our annual random inspections that we do, where we will enforce when there are violations that are found. But as a separate program, we offer people the opportunity for us to come in and to do an inspection. And if they ask for us to do that, we'll go through and give them a top-to-bottom report card of what we find. And as long as they fix those issues, they don't have any enforcement action taken against them. And that's the same concept we've utilized here as part of our settlement agreements. It's not a waiver of any enforcement action. It's just that every 3 years, in addition to the random inspections we do throughout the year, which are always subject to an enforcement action, including penalties, there'll be an additional level of scrutiny. And that's not going to be performed by my staff. It's going to be performed by an independent entity that is paid for by the Department of Energy, which reports to my staff. And so this concept that stipulated penalties have somehow been waived by the state for work at Los Alamos and the waste isolation pilot plant is just has no basis in fact whatsoever. And in fact, not only will stipulated penalties be part of a revised consent order, but I've specifically directed my staff to increase the stipulated penalties that are in the current consent order. For the reason that the work was supposed to be done in 2015, it's not, and I think it's reasonable to expect that the new deadlines, which will be put in place, will be better and be more realistic, and there should be consequences if those deadlines are not met. So I thought that was really an important point that needed to be made. With respect to next steps, a couple things that we're going to do. The first is we have to keep working on our settlement agreements. That's the most important thing for the state right now, is ensuring that the 2 settlement agreements we have with the Department of Energy for Los Alamos and WIP, that those get finalized. And I think we have alignment on all of the major issues right now. Jeff Kendall just talked about this before our legislature. The biggest issue that we're still working through is when funding for projects that are set out in those settlement agreements will actually be provided. And so the department was pushing for it to be spread over a longer period than the state was comfortable with. And so we've been continuing to talk about that issue as to how quickly will DOE be able to complete all the projects that are called out in that settlement agreement. And I think we're making progress. We also are waiting on Congress to approve some reprogramming requests that will actually fund work that's required under the settlement agreements. And so right now, there's 2 subcommittees where reprogramming requests are sitting, which allows the Department of Energy to move money that's been designated or appropriated for one purpose to actually fund these projects. But they need Congress to actually provide that approval. And so as soon as those issues are resolved, I'm comfortable we'll be able to immediately execute the settlement agreements. Once we've completed the settlement agreements, we're going to turn our attention to the consent order and start working on actively figuring out what's the best revisions to this document. As Katie has outlined, I've asked staff internally to start thinking about how can you take this document and use 10 years worth of experience to make it better. And I think knowing what we know today, how could you, staff, improve it? And so that's what Katie has presented to you. And those are our concepts. Those are not concepts that I don't know if DOE agrees with them or not. We haven't really been able to sit down and, I shouldn't say we haven't been able. We haven't felt that it's appropriate to sit down and start having those substantive conversations yet until we have the settlement agreements resolved. But those internally are some of the things that we're looking at. How can we make this document work better than it's worked in the past? I've directed staff to immediately begin acting on the corrective measures evaluations that have been submitted to the department. So there's 4 corrective measures evaluations that have been submitted to the Environment Department, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted Katie to kind of walk you through exactly how that regulatory process works. That corrective measures evaluation process, which is set out in the consent order and would not change with any revisions to the consent order, that is a lengthy process. But I'm confident that we'll be able to complete all 4 of the corrective measures evaluations within the next 18 to 24 months. And there's 4 CMEs that have been submitted, and we will, at the very least, develop our selected remedy and our statement of basis for that selected remedy, like I said, in the next 18 to 24 months. I suspect we're not going to do them all at once. As soon as we complete one of them, we will put that statement of basis out for public notice and public comment and begin the process of moving forward. But those CMEs have been sitting there on our desk, and it's time to move forward with acting on them. So I've directed staff to immediately work on those CMEs, and like I said, they're going to be doing that as we speak. With respect to the consent order, we're going to continue to meet with stakeholders, such as the Citizens Advisory Board. We're also willing to have person-to-person meetings with you, and I know many members of this Citizen Advisory Board, as well as members of the public, may have discrete issues that are important to your particular community, and we will welcome the opportunity to sit down, to have face-to-face meetings and discuss your concerns and solicit that input. We will also continue to evaluate what's the best mechanism to continue to gather public input going forward. And that, specifically, the issue I'm discussing there is whether or not we will hold a public hearing before making any final changes to the consent order. Now, certain organizations like Nuke Watch have advocated for the department to hold a public hearing, and we certainly appreciate their position, but we have concerns, quite frankly, about that process, and namely that the outcome of a public hearing will be recommendations to me that I make a final decision on, and then I do not have the power to unilaterally impose those recommendations on the Department of Energy. So we would go through a public hearing that Katie described, where we spend the next 9 to 18 months working through what changes we think are the best to the consent order, and then after that 9 to 18 months, be in the same position we're at today, where I will sit down, me, obviously not just me, in fact I won't be there for most of the meetings, Katie and Jeff and all of their respective staff members will be involved in substantive, lengthy conversations about what changes are appropriate to the agreement. So we have to weigh what makes the most sense for the state. And I think it's most important, though, to make sure that we have meaningful input from the public. And when this document was first agreed to back in 2005, there was no opportunity for the public to actually participate in that process. And so we agree that there absolutely needs to be public participation in the form of direct meetings, public comment, public feedback, responses to public comments. And so we're committed to making sure that we, as we move forward, that we do this in a way that's completely transparent. And along those lines, that's one of the reasons why we wanted to come here today and just tell you exactly where we are, what we're thinking, and how we plan to move forward. We'd like to hold additional meetings with the CAB as well as other groups, such as the Regional Coalition of Los Alamos Communities, and anyone else that would like, I said, to have direct face-to-face meetings, whether that's a municipality or a non-governmental organization. We will welcome that feedback and input. And I think the last point that I would make is that, again, what's critical for us is to understand what information we can provide you to try to meaningfully participate in this process. So Katie had discussed the campaign approach, and we've asked the Department of Energy to provide information to you in the form of specific discussions about what is the work that remains, and how could you logically, if it was up to you, DOE, how would you logically group this work together going forward? And as a caveat to DOE's presentation, they're not here presuming that this is the right approach. They're here because we've directed them to take the remaining scope of work, and if it was up to you, how could you logically group all of this work together going forward? So by coming here with campaigns, it's not that there's been a decision. We haven't discussed, these are the best campaigns, this is the right way. We just need to start from somewhere. And so we've asked them to give you information that would describe specifically what is the remaining actual work that needs to be done, and how would you group all of that work together. So we've heard that directly from you, as well as the Regional Coalition of Los Alamos Communities, that you really need to understand what are we talking about here? What type of work needs to be done? And so this is the first step in trying to get some of that information out to you. Now, it's in the form of a presentation, so it may not be as detailed as you'd like, but I think this is a good first step. And like I said, I'm not going to speak for DOE, but the state of New Mexico will continue to provide you information at your request that we have available, just to help you be able to ask questions. And ultimately, what we hope to hear from the Citizen Advisory Board is some type of feedback, which I understand you can provide directly to DOE and copy us on that feedback in terms of what your priorities are for how work should move forward, and any other suggestions with respect to how we can improve this consent order document itself. And so that's really the outcome that we're trying to get from here, is more just, first and foremost, tell you where we're at, what we're thinking, but then also just make that request to you for how can we help get you the info that you need. Some of this information we simply don't have at our disposal, in particular budget information. I have acquired information on, like I said in the beginning, how much they estimate the remaining scope of work to be at the laboratory, but we're happy to help when you have those requests. If we don't have that information, we will certainly ask the Department of Energy on your behalf to provide that information as well. We've provided that cost information because we had it, and we thought it's something I've heard from you all on a number of occasions, and I thought it's something that's important to get out there to the public to understand exactly how much money we're talking about at a very, very minimum in terms of what it will take to clean the site up going forward. And ultimately, that's a big issue for us as a state, is ensuring that our budget is sufficient. We have $189 million. The state's preference would be for about $255 million to be appropriated every single year for cleanup up at Los Alamos. We believe there's more than enough work that could support $255 million worth of work up there, and we believe that's an exceedingly reasonable amount given the broader amount of money that's spent on cleanup throughout the weapons complex. Now we're only at 189, and we continue to press Congress to take recognition of how important New Mexico as a state is, not just the Los Alamos National Laboratory, but the state of New Mexico. We have certain things in our state that no other state has, such as the WIP. And so we hope to continue to be able to advocate for funding moving forward. And like I said, this map I showed you in the beginning, this is a really difficult place for us to be in right now, where Congress, this is a number they've put because they know the current schedule of 12/31. We didn't give them TBD. That's a decision they've made, that date is not going to work. And they've told us over and over again that we need to know what the plan is before we're going to be able to increase your budget. And so we absolutely need to move forward and get this document revised as soon as we're in a better position to do so. And just as a last note, the current consent order that was executed in 2005, it will remain in effect until we make any changes. When January 1st, 2016 comes around, the document doesn't just go away and dissolve. There's a schedule that's attached as a table, but the document itself specifically states that the document will not be completed. The document will not expire until we've completely and finally resolved that all the cleanup that was required has been done, and it has been done to levels that the state has determined are appropriate. So this document does not expire at the end of this year. The work is required to be done. It will continue to remain in effect. However, we certainly need to be conscious of timing because the longer we wait to get a new document in place, the more risk there is from a budget funding perspective. So with that, I'll be happy to turn it over to the DOE, and I can answer questions now or wait till the end of the process, whatever the CAB would like.
Secretary Flynn, I've had a discussion here with DOE a little bit to have the board ask questions. If you have questions of Secretary Flynn or Mrs. Roberts,